Okay, let's talk about this track by Genesis. This is called Tonight, 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 and it came out in 1986, and it's probably the perfect example of a song to start with in terms of giving you a glimpse behind the curtain for how I'm going to recreate all of these iconic 80s sounds. As we've said before, Arcade Orchestra is not a cover band. We're not just going to do one-to-one recreations of these songs. However, all of the elements that make them sound the way they do, all the synthesizers and drum machines and effects and all that sort of stuff, that's all going to be there, but we're going to reimagine them in some ways. We're bringing in live orchestra, guest vocalists, guest artists, an epic percussion ensemble called Stickyard, and so on. So anyway, we wanted to start showing you a little bit of how we're going to do this. This song is a good example because it's not an easy one to recreate. Here's why. The foundation of the song is a drum machine. It's this guy back here. It's called a LinnDrum. And this thing was super prevalent. You heard it everywhere. So it starts with a pattern that Phil created. But the signature sauce on that song, it all comes from an effects unit called an AMS reverb. And that reverb was as much a part of the song as any of the elements. Another big part of the song is Simmons Drums. You heard these electronic drums all throughout the 80s, certainly with Phil Collins and Genesis and a ton of other artists. Those two elements are a big part of this song. So I thought it'd be a fun song to start giving you a glimpse of the production process and how to, rebuild this stuff in a totally authentic way. And that's the goal. It wouldn't be any fun to do this with plugins on a computer. We want it to be like we're in the studio in the 80s with the gear that made these iconic sounds, and we're doing it to the most meticulous degree possible. And I think that's just fun. It's just part of the process. So here we go. Let's take a peek behind the curtain at Tonight, Tonight, Tonight. So I'm going to show you how I recreated the main pattern that plays throughout the song. It's the first thing you hear when the track starts. It is all LinnDrum, and then Phil starts playing live drums and Simmons drums on top of that. So, but anyway, I want to start by breaking down the pattern into all the individual elements. I tracked each of them separately, so I can mix them separately in Logic and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, let's start with the sounds. The first thing I did is the tambourine part, and the way this is laid out is you've got 8 times 2 pads, so you got 16 sounds. But then you also have a percussion layer. If you turn that on, up here you've got 2 cabasa samples, 2 tambourine samples, high and low conga, cowbell, and claps. So, because I want to use the tambourine, I'm going to engage percussion, and I'm going to play the tambourine part. Okay, the next sound is the clap sample, and this happens pretty much every quarter note, and that goes like this. Okay, so now we go to the main elements, kick, snare, and toms. So the way the Linn is laid out, you basically have the same sample at 3 different velocities. These pads aren't velocity sensitive, so you typically have a high and low velocity. In the case of the snare, you have 3 different velocities. So let's put our kick drum down, and that goes like this. Okay, next is a big fat Linn snare sound, and this has a ton of beef in it. If you look at this on a analyzer, you'll see a lot of low end, and that's what makes this snare so commanding in this track. And that part goes like this. Okay, next, and the most recognizable thing I think about this drum pattern are the toms. There's 3 different toms, low, mid, and high, And then there's a separate conga part, which I'll play in a second, but the toms is what you first hear, and it's just instantly recognizable. Now, the thing I want to talk about is the way you're hearing it first is with the AMS reverb, which is a big part of this track. So I'm going to play it like that, and then I'm going to show you what this machine sounds like with the AMS turned off, because that's really, really interesting. And, you know, because it kind of shows, you know, that all these pieces go together to make the whole. So here is the tom part. Okay, the last piece of this pattern that makes it all work is the conga. So we're going to go back to the percussion layer, and it's the high conga sample, and it answers what the toms do. So the tom, you hear those three toms, low, mid, high, and then you hear this little repeat from the conga. So there you go. That is the sum total of the drum loop that goes all the way through the song. It's all from the LinnDrum. And, you know, the other cool thing about this machine is every drum can be individually tuned. Well, not every drum, but the snare, the toms, and the congas, those can all be tuned up or down individually. And so part of kind of deconstructing this to figure out how to reconstruct it is, you know, finding the original sounds and then pitching them to match the track. Once you do that, and then the other thing is that the toms are all panned left to right. The high is on one side, low is on the other. Those are really all the details as far as what comes from the Linn. The other thing that really makes the track, and it absolutely transforms the track, is the AMS reverb. So let's talk about that. Okay, so the next sound in this song that's really iconic comes from a Yamaha DX7 of all places. It's the really high back and forth, you know, synth lead part, and it apparently was a factory marimba sound, which is kind of crazy because it doesn't sound anything like a marimba. I was able to kind of reverse engineer it. I'm not 100% happy with it yet, but it's extremely close. So here is the sound. I'm going to play it for you by itself. Okay, so that's the sound by itself. Obviously it sounds nothing like that. So let's go in and look at the plugins that I'm using to bring this sound more into line with what you heard on the record. So you can hear how the AMS reverb is, again, a really big piece of the puzzle. That's what gives it that ambience and the slap back and all that kind of thing. So that's that sound. Okay, so the last piece of the puzzle for the original foundation of the track, you've got the LinnDrum pattern, you've got the DX7 marimba, and now we need to add the big pad. And chances are, I don't know for sure, what Tony Banks used was probably his Prophet 10. It certainly sounds like that, and it's an easy sound to recreate with a Prophet. And I was able to pretty much nail it with the Prophet 5, but I tweaked it a little bit. I made it a little bit bigger than the original, and it's basically two different octaves of the same sound, and it's just big and massive. And so this is what it sounds like. big, you know, open sawtooth pad. And so I added some things because, you know, a Prophet 5 is mono. And so typically what you would do is you would run it through like a Roland Dimension D. Chorus was popular back then. So I'm using and actually Roland has a plug-in that nails that in this case. It's called the Xenology Chorus, and it gives you all their different vintage chorus options. And I'm also running it through a little bit of a Native Instruments replica, which is an analog delay, and that just gives it a little bit of animation back and forth, makes it kind of have a little bit of that slap back to it. So let's put it all together, and this is what it sounds like. So, I'm not a drummer, but you can't recreate the 80s without Simmons drums. I mean, these things were everywhere from about 1981 all the way through the rest of the decade. And, you know, they're such an iconic sound, and very few artists didn't use them. Certainly Phil Collins and Genesis made probably the heaviest use of them. And so while I'm not a drummer, I'm going to cue up the bridge to the song. They did a little bit of a breakdown thing, and Phil played all this stuff on Simmons. I'm not going to try and match that by any stretch, but I'm going to try and just give you a feel for what they add to the song. So there you go. That's the last piece of the puzzle on this song. And then we move on to start actually adding orchestration and all that kind of stuff on top of the original elements. So here are the Simmons drums. Okay, so we've heard all the elements that go into the original track. The LinnDrum, the Simmons drums, the Prophet 5 pad, and the DX7 marimba patch. What about all the stuff at the beginning of this video, the big film trailer sounding orchestral score? That's the kind of stuff that we're going to do with Arcade Orchestra. We're going to reimagine these things using the original elements that you heard in the 80s, but with these, you know, reimagined live orchestra elements on top, plus stickyard, which is a big tribal percussion kind of thing, and a choir and guest artist. So, to give you an idea of what goes into that, I'm going to mute the original elements. I'm going to mute the LinnDrum, and I'm going to play the mock-up that I've created of the orchestral part of this. And that's how this process works. I kind of do this all on the computer, imagine it all with sample libraries, but what we'll end up doing is going in the studio later this spring and tracking the orchestra and percussion and guest vocalists and all that kind of stuff. So for now, for the play out, I'm going to play you the reimagined idea of what this particular track is going to end up sounding like. Hope you've enjoyed this. We can't wait to bring you more, and we can't wait to see you back in the 80s with Arcade Orchestra. Take care.